Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm Chad from Turner's Warehouse, and today we're doing a live casting demo on tube-in casting. Now, today we don't have anyone in the shop here watching. Last week we did have a few people. If you're in the area, you're always welcome to come down to these Wednesday demos and watch them in person, but we will live stream them and post a video after either way. So today we are going to do tube-in casting, and I want to explain briefly what tube-in means. Tube-in casting is very cool because it's hard to say it's more versatile than color casting because the color options are infinite, but it's almost as infinite because we are taking a tube and we are wrapping that tube with something, and then we are casting it to make a pen. Now, we're going to go over that process here today. We're going to take a bare tube. We're going to use a stock certificate that I'm going to show you here in a sec. And then we're going to cast it in a mold. And the reason we do that is because once we've turned it, we get this really cool, shiny, clear coated item. This is a vintage stock, which I like because they look old, because they are. And then this is a playing card. This was cast by a guy named Patterson years ago, and it still looks amazing. It's a king playing card. You can see the heart there. And then here's some finished examples. Once assembled, this is some money from a foreign country. Looks really cool. And then these are some paper label casts with the We the People and the distressed flag. So you can do a lot of different things. You can print anything you want to cast, as long as it's not copyrighted. And you can cast it, so you can make really kind of anything. So if you have a club or a business or you're working for someone, you can make stuff to fit anyone's needs. And it's really cool. So let's real quick go over what we're gonna need for this. And I kind of have broke this into two groups. We'll start with the casting side, kind of the basics. We're gonna use a tube-in mold. We're gonna use epoxy resin. Today I'll be using liquid diamonds. We need a scale, some cups and stir sticks, our pressure pot, and then our safety equipment, some rubber gloves to keep our hands from getting all gooey, and some glasses for when we pressurize that pot. And that's what we're going to use for casting. Then on the blank making side, we're going to use this little rolling jig. We're going to use some clear templates, and I'll explain more about those in a minute. We need the tubes that we want to cast for whichever pen kit, a razor blade, some scissors, some secret Elmer's purple dries clear glue, and then we need something to cut on. Now, normally I use a little rubber mat, but that's being used somewhere else right now, so I can't use it. So I'm just going to use this thick piece of cardboard for my cutting mat. And the only thing I'm trying to do is not cut my table up. So anything will work. You could use scrap every time and it wouldn't matter. Now, we're also going to need for our pen here, we're going to use some vintage stock papers to make a tube-on mold, or tube-in mold, tube-in cast. That's the word. So let's begin, and I'll kind of show you how this works. So in regards to what you're casting, there's no rules really, but you do have some trial and error. Sometimes things just don't cast well once the resin hits, especially if you're using old paper or stamps or something. You just don't know how they're going to react unless you've done it before. So you might want to test it on something, use a piece of the stock or a piece of the paper, the sticker, whatever, on something that you don't really care about in case it goes badly. And then that way you don't waste your new one if you have to tweak your formula a little bit. So always test it. Now, a lot of people print on waterproof sticky back labels, and then they peel them off and put them on, and they seem to work pretty well. So if you get a system like that down, you wouldn't have to worry about changing the materials. So you can always print your own, and then once you know how it works, you can consistently repeat that. I like to use vintage stuff, so I do test a lot to make sure it's going to work. One thing that will happen is if you're using a paper or a label of some sort, the resin's going to soak into it and it'll almost shine through, and your brass tube will kind of glow outward. So sometimes that works to your advantage and it looks cool. Sometimes it works to your disadvantage and you wish that it was a different color. So a lot of times I will use powder coated tubes, or I'll cover them in the aluminum tape to make them silver before I do a cast. And that's just to change the background so it's not so bold. The brass is very bold on certain papers. If they're too thin or they soak up too much, it goes right through. I've used parchment paper before, and it's almost like there's nothing there. It's so thin when it soaks up the resin that it's just like, it feels like nothing left to it. So just be aware of that. Now, when we have got our print or our sticker, we're just gonna call it, we're gonna use this stock here. So you can use, like I said, the vinyl or the printed stickers. You can also use stamps. Stamps are great because they have cool subject matters. I don't think you're violating any rules because you're using something that is sold by the post office, so hopefully not. But you can place them in different ways and make cool stuff out of them. But you're always safe to use your own stuff that you make yourself. So what we're gonna do is real quickly go over how we attach the label to the tube. Now, I'm obviously gonna use a brass tube here, so that's okay. It should look okay with this paper from what I remember, but we'll see if I'm remembering wrong. Now, what I like to do is kind of eyeball where my label is gonna fit on my tube. And by having these templates, this you can see says Sierra, it fits Monarch, Sierra, Gatsby, all that stuff. This is the same height as my tube, and if I were to wrap this around, it would fit just perfectly around the tube. So templates are really nice, a really nice way to see what's gonna go onto your tube. And what you can do is take your clear template and place it over your label or your paper, and you can kind of size up how big you need and where you need to cut and get just the right size. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this down a little bit here just to get rid of some of this paper out of my way. And then I'm gonna take the paper and put the label on it. And what's cool is I can see, because my template is clear, I can move it right to the edge of the blue here. I'm gonna take, my razor blade. I'm just gonna hold it down with 2 fingers. I'm gonna take my razor blade, go down the side, side 2, side 3, and without moving it, I'm gonna switch hands and go down side 4. And then you'll see I've got a perfectly sized, oh, guess I didn't push all the way through on that one, but I can see the score mark, so I'm gonna cut it with the scissors. Whoop. That's why the template's nice. All right, so I've got a perfectly sized piece that now when I wrap my tube, it's gonna wrap and almost meet, it's gonna just barely overlap, which is exactly what we want. We don't want it to overlap a lot because then you risk getting air in there or space, and you don't want that. But by just overlapping a little bit, we can line that up just how we want and roll it on. Now, there's 2 ways you can do this. Once you've got your piece cut, you can roll it up by eye and kind of tweak it, or you can use this rolling jig. Now, the rolling jig is nice because you can put the template cutout into the rolling jig. You'd want to have your glue on there, or if it was a sticky label, you'd put your tube in and then roll it, and that allows you to start square. So by using the rolling jig, you have a square start and you roll square. If you don't do that, it doesn't necessarily roll square. However, with the glue, you can't do this with a sticky label, but with the glue that I'm going to show you, you can kind of, with your thumbs, reposition it and twist it. Now, for a stock, I actually like to use it the second way because sometimes these have little features or lines or graphics, and I can roll it and then tweak it, so to speak, side to side to get them to line up exactly how I want. And sometimes that works when you use the squaring jig, sometimes it doesn't. Not the squaring jig, the rolling jig. So you just got to kind of figure out which one you're doing and how it's going to work. So I'm going to take my piece of paper here, my certificate, and I'm going to put on Elmer's glue. Now you can use a variety of glues. I found this one works well. I've probably used this for 10 years at least. I've gone through a lot of these little sticks. And I get the kind that's purple that dries clear just for that reason. So I know when I put it on that it's on because I can see that the coverage is good. And this is a secret, so don't tell anyone. You can see that the coverage is good. And then when it dries, obviously it's going to turn clear. So I like to just get it, sit the tube on there, get it started rolling. Some of you are probably better at this than me because of rolling experience. But you want to roll it up. I'll use the razor blade to make sure my ends are tucked under the upper part. And then you can kind of push on that seam, make sure there's no air in it. You can take your razor blade and push on the seam, but you just don't want any pockets where the paper is overlapping, even though it's a tiny bit. If you have air under there, when you go to cast, it's going to try to come out. So I like to push on the seam. I'll hold the seam down to the table and kind of roll the tube and look at it, make sure it's flat. And then I'll take my glue one last time, and I'll go like this right on the seam. And what you may or may not be able to see is there's a purple line right where the paper overlaps. So you want to make sure that's nice and smooth. Again, I'll push it out. And it's the really thinnest purple line right on the seam. Excuse me. And I do that with every cast like this because it seals, at least I think it seals where those papers overlap. And I don't have resin getting in there, because I think if resin gets under that lip, that's when you get the lift. So if you've done this before, we've all had it where it lifts off, and that's the worst thing because it's essentially ruined and there's nothing you can do once the resin is hard. But by doing this, it really eliminates a lot of that. I haven't had that in a long time, and I think it's because of that. Now, I like to let these dry a little while. You can heat it up. And then there's just the tiniest bit of overlap here on the ends. I like to take the corner of the razor blade and just slide it right on top of the tube and just kind of roll it with my finger. You want a good sharp razor blade. You don't want a used one because you want that really, you see that little curly cube? You just want to roll that and cut it right up to it. So it's perfectly trimmed by doing that because you're not starting too low or too high. You're right against the brass tube. And it just trims it right off, and you can see that that is perfectly trimmed, hopefully. Now this, I don't know how close we are here, but this, I'll post some pictures on the medias, but this is a stock, and it says 100 shares. It's got a cool crooked angle to it and then a straight line. So just by doing that and getting it square, I kind of eyeballed that at the top. You can see it's really symmetrical. So in a pen, when this is long, it's going to look good because my long lines aren't skewed. If they were skewed, it would kind of look sloppy. But this is going to look really good because it's nice and straight and all the lines are good. So that is how I put a tube or a label or a print, a vintage piece of paper onto a tube. You can do all kinds of vintage paper. You can do labels. You can do like ticket stubs, playing cards, old matchbooks, all kinds of stuff that really looks cool like this. So it's kind of an endless thing. Now, it's always the same process unless it's a sticky back item like a stamp or a label that you've printed, then you don't have the freedom to kind of twist and move it. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to move now to casting these tubes. I'm actually not going to cast this one because even though this stuff dries in appearance fairly quickly, I would like to leave it at least a day. So I wouldn't cast this till tomorrow at the soonest because even though that glue dries fairly quickly, you want to let it gas off. Any glue when it's curing will create some sort of gassing on some level, and you don't want that in your resin. It'll create bubbles and pockets and things. So just make sure you wait a little while before you cast them. But through the magic of TV, I have some right here that are ready to go. Oh, this is a junior series too. Okay. So this is a junior series. You can see it's a cap and body. These were old stamps, Now, funny thing about old stamps is they're not sticky back, but they were the kind you would lick and then stick on. I don't do that because that would be gross, one, and it wouldn't be as good of a glue, I'm sure, for gluing it to metal. So I still use the Elmer's with the old stamps, and it works great. But I'm going to use a tube-in mold. Now, the cool thing about these tube-in molds is they fit just perfectly. Let me think here. Yeah. So I wanted to show these two molds because these are both P-Town Subby tube-ins from Turner's Warehouse. And you can see one is a lot lighter inside. All my label casting, whether it be any material, cards or paper or labels or even watch parts, anything tube-in, I almost always use epoxy. And most of the time it's liquid diamonds. And epoxy is very, very hard on molds. It ruins molds quickly. So you can see that this one is quite a bit whiter inside than this one, although this one's starting to get there. And what that is the epoxy dries out the mold. So when they're new, they feel nice and soft and smooth. And now if you feel this white one, it's very rough feeling and dry. And it's sucking the moisture out every time. And you can get as few as 5 or 6 casts out of one of these with epoxy, or as many as 10 or 15 if you're lucky. You will help yourself by spraying mold release in them each time. So always put mold release in them. Let the mold release sit, let it kind of soak in, and that'll help extend the life. The other thing is if you're doing a lot of casting and you make a cast and you pull these out and you take the blank out and you want to start another one, if your mold is still warm from the casting and from the epoxy, let it cool down. If you cast right away on a hot mold on these, sometimes I feel like it shortens their life. So that's just my theory through experience, and I've done a lot of cycles with these, and they tend to wear differently if you let them cool down or not. So that's just one thought. Now, the beauty of these molds is they hold the blank up. So they come with these little plugs, and the plugs just push right in. And I like to put in one side, and then I put in my tube, and then I'll put in the other side. And what that does is it fully suspends the tube in the mold so that the resin gets all the way around it. And what we get in the end is a tube that's perfectly floating in resin, so to speak, with just little bits on the end that we trim up. We square this up and it's ready to turn. It'll turn very nicely. You can see how clear that is. So the resin is really nice and clear. But this allows us to suspend that tube so we can get the perfect amount of resin around it without wasting a lot of resin. Now I'm going to actually switch this. I didn't bring out my plugs for the Junior. I was planning on doing a Monarch. So I'm going to do that instead. I've got a Monarch right here ready to go. It's another stock that I did the other day. So I'm going to put in the plug, put on one side. Now it doesn't matter where you place the tube in here. I either like to place it to where I see the business end of the blank, like the exciting part, like a name or something, or I like to put the seam on top. And that way, if there is an air bubble trapped on the seam, it has the most chance to leave from the top. If you have the seam on the bottom and there's an air bubble trapped, chances are it's not going to get around that tube. Even with pressure, it might sit there and cling. So I would either put the cool part or the seam on top in your cast. Question was, how long should you let your mold release sit before casting? You know, that's a good question. I don't know if there's a specific time. I'm sure there is from the manufacturer. I'll see if I can find out, but I always shoot for at least 5 minutes. So if I know I'm going to cast, I might go in the morning and spray everything, and knowing I'm going to cast at some point that morning. Or if I forget, I'll spray it first thing when I'm getting everything ready, and by the time I'm ready, usually it's okay. I just don't like to spray it and then immediately pour resin in it, because sometimes, and it depends on the mold release, I'm using Stoner mold release, but sometimes mold releases have a clumpy or powdery feel to them when you first spray them, and that can float into your resin. So that's why I never do it right before I cast, but even 5 or 10 minutes is enough usually. Good question. So once you've got this floating, you can do one side or the other. Sometimes there's a little spillway in something like this. And the main reason I would guess is because you always cast a top and a bottom for this kind of pen because it requires two pieces. But a monarch or a bolt action, you can cast one or both. And even this, you could cast both. You would have to put plugs in the other side though and fill it all the way up. So you are wasting one side if you just did one in that kind of a mold. But this is pretty simple to do, so you can test it. If you're not sure how something's going to work, do one, because I've heard it way too many times and done it myself where people say, yeah, I did a batch of 20 and they failed. And it's because they didn't test the first one and figure out what they could do to make it work right. So just test one if it's something you've never done before, for sure. So we're going to get our resin out here. Now we're doing one side, so not very much resin. I'm going to use epoxy resin, liquid diamonds. You can see that the resin is got one large bottle and one small bottle. And that is because it is a 2-to-1 resin. So we want 2 parts of part A and 1 part of part B. So in this case, I'm going to go, I think 1.5 is what I can do on this one. It's been a little while. So I'm going to go 1.5 ounces. Now, a lot of people will use grams. Some use ounces. Use whatever you're comfortable with. For some reason, ounces are easy for me, so I'm just going to use it. I'm going to pour the part A in. Whoa, I went way over there. Okay, I'm going to have a little extra. So you got to pay attention when you're pouring it. All right. I got to really pay attention part B because I don't want to add more A. All right, I nailed it. Okay, so I'm just using a paper cup. And I'm going to use a stir stick. Now, epoxies, you want to stir really, really thoroughly. I always say with liquid diamonds, stir at least 3 to 5 minutes. And that is because it's a thermo-cure, meaning the 2 parts have to mix and start to heat. And that's what sets the resin. So sometimes resins like this, you can't pour, like 1/4 of an ounce, if you could do the math. Because it won't build up enough heat to cure. So it might not cure, or it might take a really, really long time if you do too small of a batch. So when you're doing it, you'll kind of learn, depending on the resin you're using, how quickly it will cure. But always make sure that you mix enough resin to cure the resin if it's that type of thermo cure. So this, I ended up doing 1.25 ounces plus, so we're almost 2 ounces here, so this will set no problem. Be aware of temperature. If you're casting in really hot temperature or humid temperature, it can either slow or speed up your time depending on which one it is. Winter, epoxies are very, very slow to cure. Somebody called me once and said, hey, my resin won't cure, and I was like, well, tell me about your situation. And they were casting in like 12 degrees. So essentially their resin was freezing, which means it would never build up temperature to cure. So always make sure that you're in an environment where you give your resin a chance. Now this resin, once I'm done stirring, I can pour it in right away because I'm not worried about color separation or any of that. This is going to be clear. However, I will let it sit just a sec because once I've mixed the 2 parts, it's going to start to warm up. And the warmer it gets, it's going to get thinner. And when it's thinner, the bubbles will rise more or faster. So in here, this is probably 74 degrees, which is what the air conditioner is set on. So it's something around there. That's pretty cool for it, and it's probably going to let the bubbles rise really slow. As soon as I mix the 2 parts and it does start to heat, it'll start to rise out. Now, the pressure pot will cure that, but you're probably asking yourself, what if I don't have a pressure pot? What do I do then? So if you don't have a pressure pot, always use epoxy. Urethanes need pressure. They need that pressure pot to crush the air down, and it just doesn't come out well without it. So if you are going to try to cast without pressure pot, use an epoxy. I like this one. Like I said, the liquid diamonds is very thin. It's a very thin viscosity, especially once it warms up. So if I wasn't using a pressure pot, I would mix this up. I'd probably let it warm up to 100 degrees or more before I pour it in there. Even though I don't have to wait for the purposes of the pour, by waiting that long, it lets the most air come out of it, and I don't trap air around my piece. Now, you can also vibrate your resin, you can vibrate your piece, and that'll help air rise and move through the column of your block. So you want to do whatever you can to give yourself the most chance of success without bubbles. And I always say a pressure pot's the best way to go, but if you don't have a pressure pot, don't not try things, because you can still make things. As a matter of fact, I have a great customer who comes in here all the time. He's been casting a couple years. He doesn't use a pressure pot ever, and his stuff looks really good. So he's figured out a way to make it as least bubbly as he can. Now, of course, when you're stirring like this, like I have been for a couple minutes here, I'm putting air and I'm pounding it in there. So let that air, stop stirring, let that air come out, and it'll help you a lot. The question is, do you recommend warming the mold? Do I recommend warming the mold? No. Many people do, and it's fine. Warming the mold will typically help you with corner wicking and things like that. With this epoxy, I have never noticed, and here's a good example of it, I've never noticed a problem with it retracting too much, because what happens is the epoxy shrinks, and warming a mold helps keep your material spread out into the corners. I don't find that that's an issue with this. And actually, to be honest with you, I live in Arizona. I don't warm anything ever, because I'm always trying to cool everything. But even block molds and stuff, I don't warm. Occasionally I'll have a little corner wicking or a little pullback, but not enough that it makes a difference. If you're in a cold environment, you might be better off warming the mold, so you'd have to kind of experiment for that. But because of my climate and temperature, I don't warm molds. But that's a good question. Spilled some resin. All right, so I'm ready to pour this. I've got my resin here. I'm gonna kind of give it a tap, let it jiggle out. And I can actually feel, I don't have my temp gun because I really wasn't concerned about temperature, but I can kind of feel that the resin has warmed just in that amount of time that I held it. One other thing, there's a bunch of bubbles, and that's what's risen since I stopped stirring and since I tapped it. So I can kind of pour around it to where I don't pour that clump of bubbles right into my thing here. Now I don't really need gloves for this, because I'm gonna pour it real quickly here and put it in the pressure pot. I'm using a California Air Tools 2.5 gallon. This is probably the best choice of a pressure pot for 90%, maybe 95% of casters out there, maybe more, because it's a great size. You can do a ton of casting in it. And to do, unless you're just doing a big cast, to do much more in a 5 gallon or a 10 gallon, you got to be real skilled and real fast, because if you're using a pot rack like this that you can put multiple shelves in, if you're doing 2-bin casts, you can probably get 12 or 15 of these in here. So even no color, even doing clear, filling up 12 or more molds takes a lot of time, and getting it in the pot, you just want to be realistic. So this pot is my choice for most people. If you need to cast bigger stuff, obviously a 5 gallon or a 10 gallon might be right for you. But I'm just going to cast, I'm going to pour this right into the mold, just the one side here. And I just pour it in and let it kind of push around the blank. I like it nice and full, so make sure it's full. You'll kind of get a little tension on the corners to where your resin will kind of bow up, and that's totally cool, because as it cures and shrinks, it'll kind of flatten out and be a little divot. So you always want it nice and full. Now, sometimes, especially on certain papers, I wait a minute before I put this in, because sometimes those papers actually soak up enough resin that it moves the resin in the mold. This one I'm pretty familiar with, won't do that. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in. It is nice and full. And even with one little item like this, I still use the pot rack, because I like to just be able to pick it up like this and put it in, and I don't have to worry about tilting it or tipping it or spilling it like I've, of course, never done before. All right. I'm gonna put this on here. Now, this is a great tip here, so highlight tip. When you're doing tube-in casting, and now this is my opinion, so somebody might disagree, I do not like to go over 40 pounds because with anything with plugs or air in the tube, if you go over 40 pounds, you risk breaching that center and pushing your resin into the center of the tube. So 40 is my max. If I'm at 35, that's okay too, but I do try to get it close, but I do not go over 40. To me, I'm just asking for trouble for myself. So you attach it, look at your gauge. All right, I'm gonna stop there. That's between 35 and 40. So it is good. And now that is ready to go. How long do you need to wait for your resin in the mold? Depends on the resin. In this case, epoxy liquid diamonds. It's the afternoon, it's 3 o'clock here in Arizona. I'll probably go home tonight and leave that in. I can take it out in the morning and it'll be fine, and I could do another cast. Epoxies take longer. You want to leave them in the pot at least 8 hours. If you can leave them longer comfortably, go for it. But at least 8 hours. Urethanes you can demold after 2 or 3 hours. But like I said, I like the epoxies for this type of casting. So that's what I use. So you are going to get a block like this. When you're done, you will square it. I always use the squaring jig on the belt sander for this type of pen blank to square. I think it's just better with the epoxy, and I can see it. It's nice and clean. And then you are ready to turn. It's that simple. So I hope everyone liked that quick demonstration on tube-in casting. It's a great way to start casting. It doesn't take as many different things as other types of casting. So you could literally get yourself one mold for one style of pen, some liquid diamonds or a resin like this, and start casting just with this stuff right here, and of course a scale and that. But you don't have to have the pressure pot, but it's always better, and that could get you started. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us at Turner's Warehouse. If you have not already, please subscribe to this channel because we are putting up new videos all the time. Thanks for watching.